He was the highest paid and most famous athlete in the most popular sport of his time. We're talking about Indianapolis native Major Taylor, who was a world champion cyclist around the turn of the 20th century. His story is chronicled in the book by author Jim Fitzpatrick entitled Major Taylor in Australia. Author Jim Fitzpatrick is with us. He's speaking here at Central Library as part of the Central Indiana Bicycling Association lecture series for 2011. Jim is a Native American but has spent most of his adult and professional life in Australia. And Jim, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure
and
to
a
be
real
here.
treat to talk about a sporting character who maybe not a lot of people in Indianapolis, they may know the name but don't know that much about Major Taylor. Who was Major Taylor?
Well, Major Taylor was, of course, a black American athlete born in 1878 in Indianapolis. Grew up here, became very early on very proficient at the use of the bicycle, and he got his nickname because he would perform in front of a bicycle shop some tricks, and he wore a quasi-military looking outfit, so they nicknamed him the Major, and that stayed with him the rest of his life. By the mid-1890s, he moved to the Massachusetts area because there were racial tensions and problems for him in the Indianapolis area. So in the Massachusetts area, they were much more liberal about allowing him to train with white cyclists and ride on a number of the tracks there. And in 1896, he turned pro, and in his first professional race, he beat the world champion, the reigning world champion in Madison Square Garden. And of course, there was no mistaking the messenger or that message.
Wow.
In 1897 and 1898, he was the best cyclist in the United States, voted by the Sports Writers of America. And in 1899, he won the World Sprint Championships in Montreal. Then in 1901, he went to Europe and proved himself beyond a doubt. He won nearly 3/4 of all the races he rode in against the best Europe had to offer. So it was clearly proven that Major Taylor was the absolute best athlete in what was the most popular sport in the world at the time, and in the process became the first African American to win an international sports championship.
Yet he was wildly popular overseas in all the other continents, but not so much here in America because of the racism and other obstacles that he had to face, correct?
Well, he was very popular here in the sense that when he raced, if he was at a cycling meet, you were guaranteed basically financial success by the promoters. So he was tremendously appreciated in that sense and followed very closely. But he did suffer in American cycling circles a lot of prejudice, a lot of intimidation, some very dangerous riding efforts to prevent him from winning on the track. And he had difficulty, of course, often finding meals or accommodation near the velodromes. So he did have a lot of problems, but he was very popular. In Europe, he packed the place, extremely popular and still well known. And in Australia, when he went there in 1902-3 and 1903-4, he was, again, a man who just packed the stadiums, and they created, in fact, the richest cycle race in the world to lure him down there. So that's basically what he meant to the sport.
It's amazing to think what he would have done in today's Tour de France or any of the major cycling events in the world today. He had an American rival, though, and in 1904, I understand there was a it came to a head, his rivalry and competition.
Yes. In 1902, an Australian promoter, named Hugh McIntosh, invited Major Taylor to Australia. Now, Hugh McIntosh is one of those interesting characters who 4 years later put on the first black-white heavyweight boxing match in Australia between Johnson and Burns. Then McIntosh cut his teeth with Major Taylor in one sense. So he brought Taylor to Australia, put on the richest cycle race in the world, and the second year he wanted him back in 1904 season. But they were worried whether or not the crowds would come back because Taylor won pretty much everything in 1903, and from a promoter's point of view, you want a packed house.
Sure.
So another gentleman named Floyd McFarland from the United States came to Australia along with another rider, which he was coaching, who won the World Championships that summer. So they were two of the best in the world, those guys. Now, a problem with Floyd McFarland was that he was an avowed racist, and he had made a vow that Taylor would never again win a U.S. or World Championship, and it was that simple. And what happened in Australia, McFarland himself, with 3 or 4 other white American riders who came down with him, and several of the Australian riders, basically made arrangements and teamed up during that season to prevent Major Taylor from winning almost any races. And at the end of that season, it was so difficult for the Major. He had a nervous breakdown. He did not race again for 3 years, and until the twilight of his career, never again raced in America. So effectively vanished from the American sporting scene after that.
But your book is entitled Major Taylor in Australia. What is the importance of Australia in the life and career of Major Taylor?
Well, Australia brought in many respects, Taylor's career to a focus. It distilled many of the elements, the racism he faced because of the white Americans that came down, the tensions, the promoters, the efforts they put into it to try to, they scheduled extra races, which they paid him a lot of money for. But he had also a severe fall in Australia. One of the two white riders rammed him into a wall. They argued it was accident. Others argued it was intentional.
Wow.
Taylor was in bed for 10 days, the worst fall of his career. He had lacerations in his shoulders, thigh, and so on. So it was a very difficult time. And the previous year, he had earned the modern day equivalent of about $1.4 million. The second season, he did not win nearly that much money. So it really focused a lot of the issues that he had to deal with in his life, sadly, on Australian cycle tracks. Whereas the Australian crowds cheered him on immensely.
Wow.
And we're really, by the end of the season, booing the riders, both American and Australian riders, because of what they were doing to Taylor, just trying to keep him from winning, not just going out and racing fairly.
Author Jim Fitzpatrick is with us. His book is Major Taylor in Australia. And just one more quick word about the book and kind of its evolution. You actually did research for a TV movie, which aired in 1992, and then that kind of became the book, which is newly published. Tell us about that evolution.
Well, I'd researched Major Taylor, and I had a lot of information on him. And in 1987, I talked to a film producer, and he became very interested in the film, offered me a contract, and said, but we need a book for the screenwriter to work for him. So I sat down and wrote the book in 28 days, basically, September '87. And then I came back to America, and I met another gentleman named Andrew Ritchie, who at the same time as me had been researching, writing a book on Major Taylor, but it swept across his career. Neither of us knew anything about the other. As it turned out, no one wanted to publish my book initially. They said, well, no one's heard about this guy who will buy it, and sometimes more carefully couched, such as it doesn't fit our publishing schedule. Anyway, the film went ahead. Disney was a silent financier. The film was released in February 1992 during Black History Month, and then the miniseries in June of '92 before the Olympics. And then in Australia, July '92, it was launched down there. But I had trouble finding a publisher because Taylor, it took a long time for Taylor in this country to become recognized. And I'm now glad that in retrospect, I sat on the book for some time, because today there are a number of Major Taylor cycling clubs, of course, in America. There's the Major Taylor Velodrome here in Indianapolis. So he is much better known, and I think the book now sits more comfortably in terms of helping popularize one of the truly great Americans, and the first man really to break that major professional racial barrier in America.
Well, author Jim Fitzpatrick, thank you for joining us on Between the Lines. Again, your book, Major Taylor in Australia, available through the library's website. And for more information, just check the library's site at imcpl.org.